Story 1. Do you ever have an experience that you think back on and wonder if it ever really happened? Well, I have one, and it's the only one I really recall. For a little backstory, I signed up to take part in a health study my sophomore year of college. Without going into all of the details, I basically had to drive to a clinic about 2 hours away, answer some questionnaires, and have my weight and blood pressure checked. And occasionally a few other things. For the record, I'm completely healthy, as far as I know, and the study was just about wellness of college students or something like that. I actually didn't really mind the drives, as I just put on music or a podcast and enjoy driving on the open road. I'd usually leave mid-morning and head back in the evening, and on the route I drove there was never much traffic. When I'd enter the clinic, I'd ring the bell at the front desk and take a seat in a small waiting room. It was actually more of a research area and was part of a larger building. For this particular waiting room, there was never anyone else around. Cut to one time I had to drive to the clinic. Everything happened as usual, and I got to the waiting room around 10 a.m. When I walked in, I was surprised to find another person waiting. Or, I assume he was waiting. After I rang the bell and walked back over to some chairs, I couldn't help but notice that he was looking right at me. I immediately looked away, as I'm pretty introverted, and I felt that making eye contact would be confrontational somehow. However, I couldn't help but notice a few other characteristics about him. First, he was big, like at least 300 pounds. He was wearing a t-shirt, shorts, and a red ball cap. Another thing was his body odor. Even from the other side of the room, it smelled like he hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, so that was rather off-putting. Now, I'm not one to judge, and I used to be overweight myself. I also thought he might have had some medical condition. This was a clinic after all. But the way he was eyeing me was unsettling, and I only wanted to get to my appointment. After what seemed like too long, the nurse that usually takes me back appeared at the door, and we exchanged greetings as I walked over to her. On the way to an exam room, out of curiosity, I asked if she knew the other man in the waiting area. She looked confused and asked me who I was talking about. I mentioned the person I saw, and she decided to go back and check as she hadn't known someone else was waiting. I decided to go with her, and when she opened the door again, the man was gone. Now, that might not sound surprising if it weren't for the fact that we had only been away for like 10 seconds, and the man didn't seem like he'd be quick on his feet. I also wasn't sure why he'd leave so quickly. The nurse stepped out of the doorway and glanced around the room, then came back. She thought maybe he had gone to the restroom and would be back shortly. Things went normally after that, and an hour later I was downstairs in the cafeteria eating a sandwich. One of the things I liked about these trips was getting lunch there. I almost forgot to mention that I was reimbursed for the visit and would get $200. This was more than enough to pay for gas and food. I'm not sure why, but I thought I might see the man again and looked around periodically as I ate my sandwich. There weren't many other people here, and he was nowhere in sight. Later, as I was in the parking garage and about to get in my car, I can't explain it, but I felt the urge to look around again. Everything seemed normal until I froze while almost unlocking my car door. There, about 100 feet away on the other side of the garage, was that same man. And he was still looking right at me. This sent shivers down my spine, and for some reason, the fact that he wasn't moving made this all the more creepy. Then I noticed he wasn't at any of the cars. He was just standing in the empty parking lot, locking eyes right at me. I got in my car, locked it, and turned it on. I'd have to pass by him to get to the exit, so I was a bit freaked out. But what freaked me out more was the fact that when I looked up from putting my key in the ignition, he was gone. Like, gone. It was the same story from the waiting room. There didn't seem to be any place he could get to that fast. I nervously drove out into the middle of the parking level and started to make my way for the exit, holding my breath and expecting him to pop out at me any moment. But then strangely, he didn't. He had just disappeared. All the way back I was paranoid and checked my rearview mirror expecting to see a car right behind me. Luckily I didn't. Eventually I made it back to my dorm room, and later told my roommates what I saw. They agreed it was freaky, and joked that he was some kind of serial killer. Under the circumstances, I didn't appreciate that humor, but it didn't matter anyway. Now, I probably wouldn't be telling the story if that had been the end of it. Sadly, it was not. At the next visit a month later, I saw the man again. This time, it was as I was walking out of the building and going back to the parking garage. He seemed to be wearing the same clothes, with the same red ball cap, and just sitting at a bench near a small garden at the front of the building. And he was still looking right at me. I almost considered confronting him, and looking back, I wish I had. But of course I just lowered my eyes and walked by. Now, that is the end of it. I've since graduated, and I've been working for a few years now. I never saw that man again. Thinking back, I question if I hadn't just imagined seeing him. But I hadn't been low on sleep either time, and I don't do drugs or drink heavily. I hadn't been drinking or hung over when I went there. I also have never had a similar experience or seen anything like that before. If he was real, why I only saw him those 2 times, and why he was there when I was there, still makes no sense. I was actually the only one from the study who had appointments those days. The nurse confirmed this later. I guess whether or not he was real or just a hallucination, I'll never know. Story 2. This ended up not being a hallucination, so I'm not sure if it belongs here. Mods, feel free to remove it. Either way, this was without a doubt the creepiest and scariest thing that ever happened to me. To set the scene, I was an auditor for a major sporting goods chain in the Northeast United States, and as such, I had to travel a great deal. Most of the time I just drove around in my car, and I didn't usually mind it. On this particular day, I was about halfway through a 5-hour drive, and I decided to find somewhere to eat, relax a bit, and stretch my legs. I can't remember where I was exactly, but it was a smaller town. When I saw the road sign with the restaurants and stuff like that, I decided to pull off the highway. As I turned onto the road, I saw there was a mall and decided to drive there. I should mention that it was slightly below freezing and a little windy. I went ahead and parked and went inside, and when I did, I saw the mall was almost deserted. That didn't surprise me that much though, since it wasn't a peak shopping season and it was an afternoon on a weekday. I'd already eaten a while ago, so I wasn't hungry, and I decided to just walk around inside, enjoying the space and the warm air. This particular mall was rather small, and only had a single level. It consisted of 2 main hallways coming together in the middle, like a big X, with anchors at the ends. On the other side of the mall from where I had parked, there was also a movie theater, which for some reason I decided to go to. They were showing Cloverfield, which I had wanted to see, and checking the show times, it had just started. I figured I might as well see it, and a few minutes later, with popcorn and drink in hand, I came in halfway through the commercials. Looking around, there was no one else in the theater, which I felt was a bit unsettling. However, I also think it added to the atmosphere, and I enjoyed myself. However, eventually I became genuinely afraid. After what I think was about 15 minutes before the end of the movie, the projector shut off. Like, it just shut off and stopped working. I sat there for a moment waiting for it to come back on. After a minute or so, I thought that maybe someone was trying to play a joke on me and was about to jump up and scare me. But that apparently wasn't the case. After another minute or so, I decided to get up and go to the front counter. I should also mention that the lights on the sides of the theater didn't come on. Literally, the projector had just turned off. When I came to the front, I was even more annoyed to see no one there. But that's when I started to become more creeped out than annoyed. I took a look around and noticed that there was nobody in the little lobby, either staff or moviegoers. The theater had doors to both the outside of the mall and the inside. Looking outside, I only saw like 1 or 2 cars, and inside the mall I couldn't see anyone. I think I waited another 5 minutes before going through the inside doors and starting to walk through the mall back to my car. As I started walking, it felt like an even more surreal experience. There was still no one, no customers, and no one running the stores. At that moment it struck me that something might have gone down, but I also didn't hear anything like the police, so I wasn't sure. Something else I thought of was a hallucination, or perhaps an anti-hallucination, if that's a thing. It might sound a bit silly, but to me in that moment it was the feeling I got. I'd never been in a situation like this before. As I came to where the two hallways met and I started heading down the one directly leading to my car, I couldn't help but think I heard someone whistling in the distance. At least, it sounded like whistling. Or maybe it could have been a high-pitched mechanical noise, I didn't know. But either way, I was getting seriously freaked out because this place continued to be deserted. When I had come in earlier, things were pretty slow, but there were probably still around 50 people walking around outside the stores. Not to mention the people in the stores. Now there was literally no one. I thought that maybe I should have walked around outside the mall back to my car, but with the weather, I really didn't want to. Finally, I was coming up to the entrance by my car and had to walk through one of the anchors to get there. I think it was a JCPenney, and man was it strange to go through it with no one stopping and no one at the counters. I couldn't believe the staff would just leave without locking the doors and turning off the lights. Whatever. I walked through the automatic doors and then saw a group of people standing about 50 feet away from the entrance. When they saw me, they motioned for me to come over. I hesitated a bit, but eventually I walked over. What apparently really happened was someone suspected a gas leak, and after they called 911, they were advised that everyone should leave the building, which apparently meant the entire mall. So while waiting for the gas company to show up, patrons had gone home and staff went outside. Looking around, I saw a cop car and a fire engine, though neither of them had their lights on. I felt I was understandably upset because I had been left in the building, and I wanted to give someone a piece of my mind. But apparently, no one who worked in the theater was in that group of people, which made sense since I was on the opposite side of the building. I also think there being almost no one in the movie theater may have played a part. Ultimately, I decided to just let it go and get back on the road. Maybe the emotion doesn't really come through when I write this, but I swear it was such an unnerving experience. Though it's been more than a decade ago, it still freaks me out thinking back to it. Story 3. This happened to me a few years ago when I was hiking by myself. I live in Montana and love to spend time outside. Unfortunately, I also have migraines, which make a lot of things difficult. But luckily, my doctor and I found a good medication. I only bring this up because it may play an integral part in the story. On one particular day, I was hiking a trail that ran along a river leading to a waterfall. I would only be gone for the day, as I had work the next day, and I planned to hike for about 4 hours. I had already stopped to eat, and I wasn't too tired. I was just taking in the sights and sounds of nature, I guess. Eventually, I picked up on the sound of footsteps behind me, and I turned around to see an older gentleman walking towards me. He had a raggedy white t-shirt on, gray shorts, hiking boots, and a blue hat, and he carried a long walking stick. He didn't have a beard, but he wasn't clean-shaven either. Almost immediately upon turning around, he greeted me in a loud, energetic voice. He introduced himself as Jake, and told me that he'd been on this trail for about an hour. He then went on about how beautiful it was, and how he'd been on other trails recently, but which weren't nearly as beautiful as this one. Now, I like to think I'm not antisocial, but a lot of times when I'm outdoors, I prefer to be by myself. I had to force myself to make small talk. Or at least I tried. Jake was speaking so loud and so fast that it was hard to get a word in edgewise. And after about a minute or so, I realized that I had stopped walking and that we were just standing here in the middle of the forest. Jake was also standing a bit closer to me than I would have liked. I decided to start walking slowly in the direction we had been going. Sure enough, Jake followed. It was kind of awkward, because he didn't walk right up next to me. Rather, he was about 10 feet behind me. Though that meant I didn't have to look at him, I really didn't appreciate the fact that someone was behind me looking at me, and talking loudly. He just kept going on about where he had traveled and the parks he'd gone to. He told me he lived about 3 hours from here, but had to come here because he'd already been to every other trail closer to home. At first, I thought that Jake was just a very outgoing person, but I now suspected that he may have had something wrong with him. He hadn't once slowed down when he was talking, and I thought maybe he had a mental condition or was on something. It was a strange conversation, or rather, it wasn't so much a conversation as he was just talking at me. After another minute or so, I decided I had had enough, and as friendly as I could, I turned all the way around, made a waving motion with my hand, and told him that my car was just over there and that I needed to head off the trail we were on. For a moment, Jake stopped talking and looked at me. I felt like it was the first time he had been quiet. But then 2 seconds later, he picked up right where he left off. Now he was describing his boyhood home, where he'd always play soccer in the backyard. For a moment, I didn't know what to do. He hadn't even acknowledged what I had said to him. I also actually would need to head back the way we came to get to my car, which is what I figured I should do. Eventually, I just turned all the way around and started walking back. To my surprise, Jake fell silent again. But when I looked back at him, he was just staring at me. It wasn't a mean stare, but rather completely blank. And for some reason, that really freaked me out. I started walking slowly, and Jake didn't follow. I waved again and said something like, "Nice to meet you," but Jake just kept looking at me. I turned my head back around and kept walking. I was trying to process what had just happened. After a few moments, I instinctively looked back just to see where he was. But this time, Jake wasn't there. Though that might not sound disturbing, it was to me, since I didn't hear him run off. Actually, not hearing him make any sound was rather unusual. At this point, I figured he may have been dangerous and was trying to do me harm, so I scanned my surroundings again. Still no sign of him. It was also such a bizarre experience that I started to wonder if Jake hadn't just been a figment of my imagination. I decided to jog back to my car. Not a sprint, just a jog. I got there about 30 minutes later. I looked around, half expecting Jake to pop out at me from somewhere in the forest. He wasn't there. I unlocked my door, put my stuff inside, and then got in the driver's side and closed it. Right after I put the key in the ignition and looked up, I had the most horrific experience of my life. There was Jake, literally 5 feet from my window, arms limp at his sides with that same blank expression and his eyes locked on me. I think I screamed like a little girl, but I didn't care. I put it in reverse and floored it, then stopped a little bit away, put it in drive, and pulled out onto the main road. I was in for another shock. I looked in the rearview mirror to see Jake wasn't there. I arrived back in my apartment, still pretty much in a panic, and my girlfriend immediately sensed something was wrong. I told her what just happened, and she started to freak out too. Though we didn't make the connection just yet, we figured it may have been some kind of hallucination. The weird part was I'd never experienced anything like that before. The next day I called my doctor's office, and they requested I come in. Long story short, they didn't find anything wrong with me, other than perhaps my medication. Apparently I was taking the generic version of it, and the strength can vary based on what company makes a certain batch. My doctor seemed to think that maybe I just got something that wasn't as strong. She told me she could switch me to the name brand medication, but that it most likely wouldn't be covered by my insurance, which would mean I'd be paying out of pocket potentially hundreds of dollars a month. Though I was still uneasy, I decided to keep things as they were and hopefully ride out whatever change may have happened. My girlfriend wasn't pleased and insisted that I switch, but I couldn't really pay that much. Thankfully, nothing else happened after that. Thinking back to where I met Jake on the trail the first time, it didn't make sense how he could have beat me back to my car, assuming he even knew where it was. And then, even if he had been hiding out under my car, I didn't even see him get up before he appeared outside of my window. I'm like 90% sure he was a hallucination, but it's still the most downright scary experience of my life.